The U.S. has played a big role
Yes.
in our, I guess, political past this last year. How much of foreign policy will be?
Well, NAFTA was potentially, the NAFTA negotiations were potentially a big issue. It probably will not turn out to be that big in the election because they more or less managed to navigate through that. Now, we're not out of the woods yet, of course, and lots of things can happen between now and election time. The Democrats who now control Congress are suggesting that it's not necessarily a slam dunk that they're going to pass the new NAFTA as negotiated, and we may get into another round of negotiations on that, who knows. Broadly speaking, people, I think the consensus was that they'd managed to limit the damage to a fair degree in that. China, of course, is going to continue to be an issue, and particularly because we have these two people being held essentially hostage by the Chinese, a third who was imprisoned but has been now facing the death penalty. And the Chinese government has made very clear that they're not going away on this issue, and the government is going to continue to face questions about its handling of that, and that potentially could blow up in their face. God forbid if our people there are mistreated or in this one case killed, that's going to make this a very hot issue indeed for the government, because I don't think people would say they've necessarily handled this as well as they might. That's a fairly narrow frame of foreign policy, but it's unusual for foreign policy to be part of the election debate at all in this country. We don't tend to have huge debates about that. But I think there's been a question of how well has the Prime Minister himself performed on the international stage. There's been a few incidents. The India trip, of course, was only one of them, and where people might have felt he wasn't as focused on sort of meat and potatoes issues as he might have been. That, again, comes back to that competency question that I think will be part of the mix in the election campaign.
The Liberal government has yet to release the budget, and I'm just wondering what that feather in the cap will be this year. Is it pharmacare?
There's certainly rumors that there'll be some modest form of it, which I think is probably all well and good, because if you look at the costs associated with trying to do a whole, big bang approach to pharmacare, it's enormously costly, and it's not clear that a lot of Canadians want that. A lot of Canadians have drug coverage now, and one of the implications if you try to do a first dollar coverage of, where everybody's in the same pool is, so very similar to the debate in the United States is, people will be worried they're going to lose the drug coverage they have now through their employers. So it's not an easy thing to square that circle. But there is talk that there'll be something on that. Again, the last nail in the coffin, if you will, for the NDP vote, perhaps. I think because the NDP is weak, I think they've got room to tack back a bit more towards the middle and center right if they wanted to, and reassure people that in fact these deficits that they've run that are basically deficits of choice. They didn't have to. We weren't in a recession or anything. They just chose to. That these aren't going to be with us forever and ever and ever, and that they're going to be keeping the federal finances on a solid ground. So I think there's opportunity there in this budget. Whether they'll take it, I don't know.
I'm wondering whether or not the provinces will have a bigger hand in this year's federal election. I mean, we've seen the leader of the Progressive Conservatives, Andrew Scheer, aligning himself with Ontario's Doug Ford. Do you think this will be a factor this year? I mean, we haven't seen this before, have we?
Oh, not necessarily in this exact configuration, but oftentimes in provincial politics, oftentimes you run against the feds, and sometimes in federal politics you run against this or that province. There seems to be some suggestion that the Liberals would not mind running against Doug Ford, who certainly outside Ontario I'm not sure plays terribly well, and amongst a certain type of voter in Ontario wouldn't be terribly popular. They may relish a fight with Ford, who certainly seems likewise to want to enter the lists. They also, however, I think are much less keen to be in a fight with François Legault, the Premier of Quebec, who seems to be very much interested in playing a very strong hand in this election. So he's been going out and basically saying, make me an offer. Here are the issues. Here's my list of demands. You Conservatives, you federal Liberals, try and satisfy me. The Conservatives have taken some stands that are clearly intended to pander to Legault and to that section of opinion in Quebec, particularly, for example, on pulling the feds out of collecting federal income taxes in Quebec. So the province of Quebec would collect the federal income tax for them, and then by their grace and favor, they would then pass it on to them, which I think is a very worrisome idea. The Liberals have said they wouldn't do that. So they're clearly, Legault and the CAQ, the party that he leads, are very much going to be part of that campaign in Quebec, which is going to be a very open campaign. I mean, with the demise of the Bloc, I shouldn't say demise, but with the falling away from that very strong position they had in the past, and with also the decline of the NDP, you've got a four-way fight in a lot of those ridings. And so that's going to be a fascinating province to watch. But yes, the carbon tax in particular has brought several of the provinces into the fight, and I anticipate we'll see quite a bit of that.
Lastly, the legalization of cannabis. How much will that do to propel the Liberal government?
I think it's a double-edged sword for them. I think they can say that they kept their promise on that and brought in the necessary legislation. For a lot of people who feel very strongly about that issue on the pro side, that will weigh in their favor. A lot of people in different communities are worried, and maybe with some justice, about the implications of normalizing marijuana use, particularly for young people. I mean, the Liberals are clearly sensitive on that file because they've gone to great lengths to emphasize about how they're legalizing it, but they're also trying to discourage its use. And the third element there is we now seem to have a fairly significant shortage of legal marijuana. Which means if there's a shortage, if there's more demand than there is supply, then that demand is being met from less legal sources, if I can put it that way. And that was a big part of the argument for legalization, was to get the mob out of it. How top of mind that issue will be at election time is very unclear. The only thing I would say about all these issues is nobody really knows until election time, until the election is over, what were the big salient issues for people. There's going to be, of course, different issues for different people. There's millions of different voters, each with their own agendas. But the issues that we, the pundits, announce ahead of time are going to be the big issues in the election are almost never proved to be the case. Partly because the parties see that these issues are coming and try to just make sure they don't lose on that issue. So they always try and neutralize the issue. So for example, everybody always tells the pollsters dutifully that, oh, my number one issue is health care. And I've rarely seen an election that was decided on the basis of health care because people basically know there's no simple answer to it, and it's very hard for one party to really get a large advantage. You can lose elections on healthcare. People think you're bungling it, but it's hard to win elections on healthcare.